The leader of the Manhattan Project's Bomb Development Center in Los Alamos, New Mexico, was the preeminent American physicist of the day, Robert Oppenheimer. Despite his reputation as the driving force of the atomic bomb program, Oppenheimer later said he was always plagued by a sense of doubt about his role in it.
I had then, as I've had throughout this whole thing, I'm not completely free of a sense of guilt.
In New Mexico, the massive scientific effort led by Robert Oppenheimer came to a climax on July 16, 1945, the day scheduled for the first test of the new atomic bomb. The precious radioactive core of the new weapon was transported out to the desert test site in the hands of physicist Philip Morrison.
I drove down from Los Alamos in a GI-painted Plymouth with a Women's Army Corps driver, great speed and talent at the wheel, and armed convoy, because I had in my lap the special container which I and a Navy draftsman had designed to be the perfect safe home for the core of the first test bomb, what we called the plutonium core, the plutonium sphere.
The scientists were not at all sure that the test bomb would go off, or if it did go off, some were worried that it might ignite the Earth's atmosphere or destroy the state of New Mexico. The plutonium core was inserted into the device, and it was hoisted onto the top of a 100-foot steel tower. The desert test site was codenamed Trinity. Detonation was scheduled for 5:30 a.m. For the expectant scientists, it was a moment of high drama.
The most visceral and lasting feeling that I have, and that was lying there in the desert, cold desert morning before dawn, the high plateau of New Mexico, looking toward the tower, one eye blanked out with black paper, the other eye half shut behind black glasses, and all planned in advance so I could look at the thing and not be blinded by the flash. What we had left out of our preparation, at least I had, was the sense that when the thing went off 10 miles away, the heat on the face would resemble desert noon. So we went from cold dawn to desert noon in a tenth of a second. Hot face, sun burning. It only lasted a second or less, but that was an inescapable sensory experience which no one was there can ever forget.
We knew the world would not be the same. Few people laughed. Few people cried. Most people were silent. I remembered the line from the Hindu scripture, the Bhagavad Gita. Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds. I suppose we all thought that one way or another.
Once they realized the horrible possibilities of their creation, many scientists began having second thoughts about its use, especially its probable effect on civilians. They signed a petition asking the president to reconsider using the weapon, but the bomb was already in the hands of the U.S. military men who had no interest in holding back.
There was an old, and I think he was a Prussian, by the name of Clausewitz. And Clausewitz, one of his principles of war is that you fight a war to win it. And you use every means at your disposal to gain that victory. And that's been taught in military science classes ever since I first heard of a military science class. And I think that's the same thing that applied here.
On July 16, 1945, the day of the test of the atomic bomb, President Harry Truman was attending his first ever summit meeting in Potsdam, Germany, with British Prime Minister Winston Churchill and Marshal Joseph Stalin of the Soviet Union. When he was informed that the Trinity test was successful, Truman wrote in his private diary, betraying a certain self-delusion about the bomb's likely target.
We have discovered the most terrible bomb in the history of the world. It may be the fire destruction prophesied in the Euphrates Valley era. This weapon is to be used against Japan between now and August 10th. I have told the Secretary of War, Mr. Stimson, to use it so that military objectives and soldiers and sailors are the target, and not women and children.
By far the most powerful argument in favor of using the atomic bomb is the idea that it saves countless lives that would have been lost on both sides if the United States had gone on to invade the Japanese homeland. The battles on the Japanese islands of Saipan and Okinawa in 1944 and 45 are often cited as examples of the casualty rates that could have been expected in such an invasion. 36,000 Americans were wounded in the attack on Okinawa. 12,000 killed. Japanese losses in the defense of Okinawa were almost 10 times that many, 110,000 dead. Many Japanese committed suicide rather than surrender. At sea, Japanese kamikaze pilots attacked American ships with planes loaded with explosives. Hundreds of U.S. sailors were killed in such attacks. Military historians say the number of U.S. casualties expected in an invasion of Japan was over 250,000.
Raises an interesting point, though.
Richard Hallion is the official historian of the U.S. Air Force.
Now, 268,000 casualties, I think, at that time, after we have seen the defeat of Nazism, after we clearly recognize that Japan is going to be forced to surrender at some point, I think the idea of taking those casualties was simply beyond the pale. I don't think that the American people would have stood for that kind of a casualty rate.
The numbers of American casualties expected in an invasion of Japan has been the most often cited factor in defending the use of the atomic bomb. But many suggest it is a false argument, that there never had to be such an invasion. The U.S. Strategic Bomb Survey, published just after the war, contained the controversial conclusion that the Japanese would have surrendered without any American invasion and without the atomic bomb. Paul Nitze was responsible for the conclusion of that report.
They were no threat to us. What could the Japanese do to us? How could they harm us in any way? It was inconceivable that they could launch an attack against us because all their ships were gone, the fleet was gone, their Air Force was pretty well gone.
You don't think an invasion really would have been required?
I'm sure that wouldn't have been required.
Why?
Because they were beginning to starve. People don't take starvation well.
In fact, we now know that in the spring and summer of 1945, the Americans had intercepted secret Japanese cables which clearly indicated the Emperor and the Japanese High Command wanted to surrender. The only condition was that Japan would be allowed to retain the Emperor as a figurehead, to prevent him being hanged as a war criminal. The president knew about those intercepted cables and about more direct appeals from Tokyo. In his private diary, released only in 1978, Truman refers to the telegram from the Jap Emperor asking for peace. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill said there was no controversy at the time of the decision to use the atomic bomb. He said there was unanimous, automatic, and unquestioned agreement to use the weapon. That's not quite true. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, then Supreme Allied Commander in Europe, wrote years later that in 1945 he told Harry Truman he vigorously opposed the use of the atom bomb.
I was against it on 2 counts. First, the Japanese were ready to surrender and it wasn't necessary to hit them with that awful thing. Second, I hated to see our country be the first to use such a weapon.
Eisenhower was not the only military leader who thought the bomb was not required to end the war. The president's chief of staff, Admiral William Leahy, later revealed he thought the bomb was not only unnecessary, but also barbaric. He said he was not taught to kill women and children. Senior members of both the Air Force and the Navy also later claimed that the bomb was not required to end the war. There is even some evidence that President Truman believed that the war would soon end without the bomb. Truman's central objective in Potsdam was to secure Stalin's promise to declare war against Japan, something the Soviet Union had long avoided. When Stalin agreed in Potsdam to attack the Japanese before August 15th, Truman was ecstatic, confiding to his diary, "Fini Japs when that comes about." Many historians believe it is now clear that Truman did not need the bomb to end the war and save lives. One of those is Gar Alperovitz.
The consensus position, which I certainly agree with, is exactly what Eisenhower said. The war could have been ended without the atomic bomb. It's what the chairman of the Joint Chiefs said. The war could have been ended without the atomic bomb. All you had to do was tell him to keep the emperor and wait for the Russians. Now, if that was so, there wouldn't have been any invasion. There would have been no landing. The number of lives saved by the atomic bomb then is zero. Zero.
If the case is so overwhelming that the atomic bomb was not required to end the war, why would Mr. Truman go ahead and use it? Many historians point to the influence in July 1945 of the president's brand new Secretary of State, James Burns. Burns did not like or trust the Russians, and he saw the atomic bomb as a perfect tool to keep the Soviets at bay. On the day he heard about the successful A-bomb test, Burns even reversed a long-standing American policy and started trying to keep the Soviet Union out of the Pacific War.
It's very clear that what Jimmy Burns is thinking about is the post-war world. And he's looking beyond this, where he's going to be Secretary of State facing Moscow and the Russians. And many documents suggest that Burns understood, I'm going to have this pistol on my hip, or a big stick, or as Truman once said, a hammer on those boys. And he's thinking about the Russians. So many historians now accept what used to be a controversial argument, and is not very controversial anymore, that one of the major factors had to do with diplomacy towards the Russians. In other words, the bomb was aimed more at Moscow than it was at Tokyo.
For months, the elite Air Force 509th Squadron had been rehearsing the drop of the new secret weapon in the Utah desert. At the beginning of August 1945, the 509th received permission to drop the real bomb on the real target, the people of Hiroshima, Japan.